Good morning, folks. So here we are on Monday, April 20th, and we are now basically 1 month away from coming back to school since it was extended again. So, if you are watching this video and you're not right here in our chat room, please make sure that you take a look up here in Schoology in your folder, find the Eric Matthews grading changes video, and go watch that. You're going to need to know how things are altering. I'm not going to go over it here. I've already recorded it. It's sitting there, complete with a mathematical example so that you can understand it better. Today, we're here to talk about evolution. And in particular, what we want to do is we want to move past the stuff that we started with before. So I don't know whether you fully remember this or not, but last time we were going over the proofs of evolution, and boy, we had a bunch of stuff that we talked about. This is just kind of a summary for the whole thing. The new slides that we're covering today are 33 through 47. This one is one that I just included, so I didn't click through like 14 different slides in order to review the material. So just keep in mind, we were talking about the fossil record and how the fossil record shows us this transition from the ancient species towards more modern ones as we can track different traits that they have skeletally from one fossil to the next. We talked about the distribution of species down here in the bottom and bottom left, how we find the fossil remains of certain organisms spread over separate continents, separated by thousands of miles of ocean. The likelihood that the same animal would have evolved in the same places is mathematically not possible. Which means that when we find those fossils, we have to assume that once those parts were closer together, which you can see in Gondwana, the first picture there at the bottom. We talked about homologous structures. You did a lab on it last week regarding how a lot of animals have the one bone, two bones, lots of little bones and fingers organization. Analogous structures, kind of like up top middle, when we look at the fin of a shark, the flipper of a dolphin, or the wing of a penguin, they all use them to swim. But when we take a look at it, we can see that they are not closely related. That's the analogous structures. And then finally, vestigial structures, of which humans are this wild grab bag of leftover crud. But our best example, really, the one that people understand the easiest, is the pelvic bone in a whale, knowing that the whales still have that remainder from a time period so long ago when they actually used to walk with four legs instead of just having two flippers. Now, all of this was good, and Darwin faced a lot of challenges when he published his theory, but ultimately won out. Now, to give you an idea of how well he won out, evolution is completely accepted by the Vatican and every pope that we've had for the last several decades. Darwin was buried. I believe it was under Westminster Abbey, where they bury really notable, famous people who have done great good for, well, people. So the whole idea that Darwin's theory was this big contentious thing, it was contentious and there was some conflict over it, but it has been accepted by the entire world. It's only here in America that people still continue to argue and fight about something that has been settled. And what would have made Darwin's case even stronger, to the point where the arguments that some people have today would probably have been gone, would be if he accepted the help from Gregor Mendel. Now, hopefully, you remember Mendel. Mendel was our father of genetics. This is the guy with the pea plants who figured out how inheritance works. Believe it or not, Mendel sent a copy of his paper to Darwin. And at that point, the big thing Darwin couldn't understand, he couldn't wrap his head around, was how the inheritance was working. Why do you only see the good traits that natural selection would pass on in some of the offspring and not all of them? If he had ever bothered to read Mendel's paper, he would have had the full understanding that he needed. Unfortunately, all evidence suggests that Mendel's paper arrived and that Darwin kind of trash canned it. Just like, who is this random monk out in the middle of nowhere? Like, I'm not going to spend my time reading this dude's paper. If he had, the world would have changed. So now modern evolution has to use Darwin's theory of natural selection and Mendel's theories on inheritance. And once we put those two together, we get something like this big passage here. Now, I didn't color this in yellow because I just want you guys to kind of understand the idea. Just understand that natural selection is going to select the most fit individuals. They will then pass on the alleles for the traits that made them successful. Now, what that's going to do if you compound this generation after generation is it's going to change the genetics of the population. It is going to increase the amount of some alleles in that population. Ultimately, you are going to have something that is now so different that you can no longer consider it the same thing that it once was. If something goes extinct, that's kind of easy. But this is really a concept of eventually, for instance, humankind may reach a point where we can no longer look at ourselves and say, we're human. We would look at ourselves and say, well, we used to be human. But certain traits came into being, took over our population, and now it's been a while. Now we're different enough that maybe we don't count as being human anymore, and then we would create a new species name for us currently. It's kind of an odd idea, but eventually stuff just isn't the same. So try to keep that idea in mind. Later on, we're going to start going over speciation, the creation of new species, which is the next step of all of this. And for that, it's really important for you to try to remember this idea that it's all along one line, right? It's all just changes to a single organism group. But at some point you can arbitrarily look at it and say, well, this one has 5 horns, that one had 3 horns. We're going to call this something different because its genetics must have changed so much that these two may not have been able to interbreed if they lived side by side, and that would qualify as a new species. The idea of a new species is a very amorphous thing. We don't have a good definition of what a species is. Every time we've had a definition, it's been broken, and then we've needed to come up with a new and different definition for it. So I'll go over that more, but I understand if this is a little bit confusing because it seems like an arbitrary stamp to say, new species. And in fact, it is an arbitrary stamp. This can be dropped anywhere along an evolutionary pathway for us to go, and this is now a new species. Just like that. Oh, right. You guys are probably not going to want to see my face. All right. So, moving on from that, our term evolution really is going to refer to a population's genetic makeup. So these two owls are not wildly different from each other, but they're different enough that we've seen evolution occurring. Important to note that genetic variation is going to be really, really important when we get into ecology coming up after genetics, our last unit of the year. Talking about variation becomes huge. Because when an environment starts to change, you don't want everyone to be the same. If everyone's the same and the environment changes, it means that we are all equally susceptible to it. That could be real bad. Take, for example, our current pandemic. The reason that we're in isolation like this. If we were all the same, we would all have the same susceptibility to this virus. Now, if everybody was part of the highly susceptible, then we would be seeing astronomical death counts. The Black Plague, right, hit back in like the 1600s, killed off 1/3 of everybody in Europe. How did the other 2/3 survive? If we were all the same, either everybody would live or everybody would die. So having variation is incredibly important to a species surviving. Now, there is no better example of evolution or a more commonly used one than the peppered moths. Right? Here are the peppered moths. They came in two different colors. You had your white speckled one, hence the term peppered, and then you had your dark black pepper moth. Right? These are the two natural variations that they have. Some of them are a little bit darker, some of them are a little bit lighter. But that light phenotype was favored. This was high fitness. This was a good adaptation. Natural selection rewarded the light speckled phenotypes because, as you can see, they blend in unbelievably well with the white bark that was in northern England at this time period. But then something happened. The Industrial Revolution happened. We started burning coal. We started burning oil. There was no environmental protections. And so all that thick, soot filled smoke would lift. And it turned out that the pepper moths lived downstream, downstream by air, not downstream by water, from an industrial complex. And so this thick, dark, soot filled smoke drifted through their forest, and kind of like you would imagine, it coated all the trees. And as it coated the tree bark, all of a sudden we had a reversal. The white speckled moth that had been so good at blending in before no longer was. Meanwhile, the dark colored moth that before had been very easy to pick out now blended in very well. And so we had a reversal. And what we saw in a short period of time was that original population of peppered moths right here started to shift. And over the course of several years, watch my little pointer here, the bottom is time. So over the course of years, what happened was the amount of white pepper moths started to drop. And what was originally a small amount of these dark colored moths started to rise. And a couple of years later, they found that once again it had reversed. Almost all of those white speckled moths had now become dark moths because this was the high fitness trait. This was natural selection in action. It shifted the phenotype of the entire population to this new high fitness trait. Now we're going to start going over our three forms of natural selection, and they're all going to give you a bell curve like this, where we're going to see one hump which represents the original population and how it changes towards this population after natural selection. The first one is directional selection, which is literally what we just saw. It is the most common form, it is the one that we see the most, and your original population is merely going to shift towards that new high fitness trait. So due to whatever change in the environment, that old trait no good anymore or less good, and this other trait is the new good. So over time, everything shifts. Think about stupid fashion that you see in high school and stuff like that. Some new, I don't know, designer or something comes along, and this may not be the best example because, we're doing this in a single lifetime, but in nature, natural selection would take multiple generations. But the same idea kind of happens, right? What used to be the good trait that for whatever reason people put value on, now no longer is. And now the Vera Bradley bag is considered to be, one of those. And instead it's this other thing. So now you see the whole population change from that one common trait over here, zoop, over here to this new good trait. The peppered moths, of course, once again, the best example of this. The second form of natural selection is called stabilizing selection. So now the idea is both of the extremes. On the high end over here and on the low end over here, both of those are bad. The example I'm going to give you are lions. Lions are all the same golden brown color. If they're a lighter yellow, we don't see those. If they're a darker brown, we don't see those because darker or lighter did not work in the environment that they live in. They needed to be that same golden brown as the grass, as the hills, as the material that they try to hide and move through. And so those two extremes were both cleaved off. They were eliminated. So now the entire population is that golden brown color. And we don't even have those variations anymore. This is very, very common in predators. Because what makes a predator successful needs to spread very rapidly for them to kill things and survive. It's also one of the reasons that predators are in such danger when their environment changes because they don't have that variation. Remember, we just said earlier, that variation is super important. You need it to survive. And then right here, we're talking about a form of natural selection that literally eliminates variation. It is a thing, it happens, but it is not good for the long-term survival of those animals. For instance, let's imagine that Africa, due to some climate change, which is happening large scale right now, starts getting more rain. It ain't going to stay yellow and brown. It's going to start to grow yellow and green. All of a sudden, all of those lions that are a golden color may not have the advantage they used to. Survival may be a heck of a lot harder than it has been. That stabilization they've got ultimately can put them into danger. Now, one of the examples that a lot of things like to talk about, though, is humans, and in particular, human birth weight. And the reason they like to say that is because if the head is too big, you can't be born. But if the head is too small, you're too underdeveloped. All right, and then our last one, disruptive selection. So this is by far the rarest. This one does not happen much at all. And usually it's only going to occur where an environment has been really radically changed. But the idea is you get a split. The one good trait becomes two good traits. Right here used to be what the old population was, but now this low end and this high end are both good. So let's imagine that you had an animal like a capybara, kind of like a large rodent, right? Now, if they're super small, they can't fight off predators. But if they're super big, they can't hide from the good predators. So most of them end up right in this medium size range, where they're big enough to fight off the smaller predators, but they're small enough to hide from the biggest predators, right? Middle ground. Well, now let's imagine that forest changes. Hiding is no longer an option. Trees die, they fall over, it's clear cut for logging. Anything that's living there in the underbrush and the small shrubs and plants, now either you need to be real small so you can hide from everything, or you need to be real big so you can fight off everything. If you're in the middle ground, you're not good at fighting things off and you're not good at hiding. All of a sudden, this is not where you want to be, and those individuals will be selected against. That's an example of disruptive selection. Some of the examples we've seen are with sticklebacks. This is one of the videos that I had for you guys to watch last week. And basically what we find out is that sticklebacks diverged from each other into two different forms. One that feeds on larger food and one that feeds on smaller food by filtering it out of the water around them. And if you count all of these things in, then you can start to see some really bizarre and really interesting patterns. These are California salamanders. And throughout the state of California, believe it or not, the same species of salamander has a huge variety of appearances because as they've migrated across the state through the environments there, the environments change. And those changes have resulted in different good and bad traits. And so, even though these are all the same salamander, and ones from the south, way down in that green area, can still mate with ones in the blue in the far, far north, um, their traits that we see, they are on their way to becoming new species thanks to this selection. Now, that breaks down all three of our forms of natural selection. Directional, which is our traditional form that moves it in one direction. Stabilizing, which takes that normal, eliminates the extremes so that you have a much more concentrated population, less of the other traits. And then finally disruptive, which takes that one good trait and instead splits it into two good traits that are both successful in this one environment. Now, the next thing that I have for you guys is a worksheet, which is pretty straightforward, but before you start working on it, oh, please don't start working on it until I say this. Because if you go into our folder, let me bring this up again, you're going to see selection worksheet PDF right here. All right, if you open this up, like the beginning's pretty straightforward. Identify, stabilize, and directional and disruptive selection, what we just went over. And then it's a bunch of multiple choice questions. As you A, B, C, or D, what is this an example of? Stabilizing, directional, or disruptive selection. Right? Pretty straightforward. You're going to get to this one. This is came right out of Regents. Different picture, but otherwise it's all good. All right, but when you get to this page, page 4 and 5, it's the graphing pages. Don't do it. Don't try to do it. It's just going to confuse you. You're just going to be stuck thinking to yourself, well, how the hell am I supposed to? Don't worry about that. Page 4 and 5, just ignore them. They are junk. They are not going to be used for anything that we cover today or any work that I ask you to do. All right, but let's go back to Monday and talk just a little bit about this evolution packet. Now, if you take a look at it, it's 8 megabytes of PDF. That is enormous. That is absolutely huge. That is taking up it's like 86, 87 pages. I'm not assigning this to you. I'm not asking you to do it. I'm not expecting you to do it. I am providing it as like a full unit study guide type thing. And as we get closer to the test at the end of next week, I will be telling you what pages in that study guide would be good practice for you. But if at any point you feel like you've got 10 minutes, go in there, see if you can answer a couple of questions. Pop out. It is a review, practice, kind of enrichment thing. I am not expecting people to turn in the study guide, the 8 megabyte PDF. No, don't turn it in. Not looking for it. I'm not asking you guys to turn in the worksheet today. You need to make sure that you can identify these three. You will find questions just like that on the test that we have coming up for evolution, but I'm not going to be collecting it. So, with that, hopefully it clarifies everything. I hope that this helps. Tomorrow, we're going to move on into a little bit more of a lab activity thing. It'll be a short video just explaining it, and then I'm going to give you guys Tuesday and Wednesday in order to get that done. Wednesday, I will be online just like normal, but I'm only going to be here to answer questions in case people have them. And then Thursday, Friday, we'll get back into our normal lessons.